Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Today's speaker at UC Berkeley's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute is Dr. Lucarelli. Dr. Lucarelli is an associate professor of Egyptology in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Culture. She is also the faculty curator of Egyptology at the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology and a fellow of the Digital Humanities at UC Berkeley. She's presently working with 3D models of ancient Egyptian coffins and the Book of the Dead. She's also completing a new monograph on demonology in ancient Egypt. Her teaching and research in ancient Egypt is about bringing it into the contemporary world. And most recently, she began to talk about ancient Egypt in its relationship to Afrofuturism. I'm also delighted to say the other connection with us is that Rita teaches courses of Egyptology, interdisciplinary writing, comparative literature at San Quentin State Prison through the Mount Tamalpais College. Professor Lucarelli, thank you for joining us today. And we will take questions from everyone in the chat room after your presentation, and the floor is now all yours.
Thank you, Susan, for these kind presentations, and hi everyone. Nice to meet you virtually, at least for now. I'm happy today to present to you about religion in ancient Egypt, and this is in connection to the excellent exhibition currently at the Young Museum. Probably some of you already been through the exhibition. We can talk about that later if any of you has been there. I'll show you a lot of images of highlights from the exhibition. If you didn't yet, I hope you will have a chance to go. It's a wonderful exhibition, and many aspects of life at the time of Ramses the Great are highlighted in the exhibition, but special importance is given indeed to religious practices. Why? Because religion was very important in the daily life of the ancient Egyptians. So today I thought to start with discussing what was religion at the time of Ramses and how it differs from what we think is religion today. And I will let the images speak. I have a lot of wonderful images for you from the exhibition, but not only from the exhibition. The one that you see here in my first slide is actually from the exhibition now at the Young, is a statue in gray schist, and that was discovered in the so-called Karnak cachette. The Karnak cachette was a statue's hoard found at the Karnak temple in Luxor in 1900. And this cachette, so-called with this French term, so it's a sort of common burial ground, hidden burial ground, contained actually about 800 statues in stone dating from the 3rd millennium BC until the Greco-Roman period. So you can imagine for us Egyptologists, this is still one of the most amazing discoveries, and a lot of material for us to study, and for the rest of the world anyway to admire and look at. And so this wonderful piece shows Ramses II, the pharaoh, kneeling. You can see his left leg under his body and his right leg extended behind him. And between his hands, he holds a shrine with the 3 squatting figures on the top. And I have another photo that shows better those figures. They represent 3 gods. One is Amun, the other is Ra-Harakti, and the third one seems to be a child. Cannot see really from the photo, but together, they actually can be read as a sort of rebus of the name of Ramses. So Ramses Mary Amun, Ramses beloved of Amun, where Ra or Akti that you see here with the head of a falcon represents the element Ra. And the child in ancient Egyptian is Mes, so Ra-Mes. Indeed, Mes as a word for child, while Amun, the image of Amun indicates the god who loves the king. So Ramses, beloved of Amun, is how you read this composition. And indeed, in the religious world of the ancient Egyptian, the pharaoh was an important intermediary between the gods and humankind, and the pharaoh was always in life and then in death, we will see, loved by the gods. There wasn't a word for religion in ancient Egypt, in the ancient Egyptian language, but religion was mostly about doing ritual things. And so also, when I teach about religion, I tell my students that maybe the expression that in ancient Egyptian we can translate mostly as religion is hiret het, meaning doing things, basically doing religious things, doing ritual practice. What are those practices? Offerings to the gods, worshipping the gods. And these are practices that even the semi-divine pharaoh had to make daily. And this is why we have all these representations in temples of the pharaohs offering to the god, the pharaoh worshipping the god. The most important thing was to please the gods in order to get their favor. And why the favor of the gods was so important is because with this favor, the pharaoh could maintain Maat on earth. And we will look at the idea of Maat, which is the idea of justice and cosmic and social orders. All these ritual things, so, are well represented on tomb walls, on magical ritual objects connected to the tomb. And as I said, I will let the images speak today, especially through the beautiful photos made and published by one of my favorite art photographers ever, an Italian photographer, Sandro Vannini, who has been posting, I see someone know his photos. Indeed, he's been publishing many of those photos from the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings, where the tomb of Ramses II is also found, as well as from the tomb of his spouse Nefertari in the Valley of the Queens. And so let's look at images and start with another interesting images of indeed religious practices, doing things. This is from a papyrus, also the time more or less of Ramses, a bit later probably, where we see the deceased lady who is kneeling in front of a composite image, a divine image, where we see a divine baboon worshipping, so also performing. So religion was about performing a lot. So the baboon is here worshipping this solar disk. Inside the solar disk, there is an eye of Horus, which was an important protective amulet, and the solar disk rests on a large-scale hieroglyph, the hieroglyph of a mountain. So this is a composite image representing the sunset. Inside the sun, God played an important role in the ancient Egyptian religion. And within the solar disk, we see the image of the eye, that is about protection, and protection is another key word for understanding the ancient Egyptian religion. Praying the gods was for also asking protection. The all religious word of the ancient Egyptians was about making sure that humankind can be protected in life and in the afterlife, after death. And the baboon is a very important symbol of one of the main gods of the Egyptian pantheon, the god Thoth, the patron of the scribes, the god of writing. But baboons were also connected to the worship of the sun god, because baboon in the morning were being very loud during sunrise, and so the idea of the baboon worshipping the sun is a representation indeed of a typical religious practice. And we see the deceased that is approaching this divine world, and so participating to the ritual to make sure that the sun will rise and then set down every day, maintaining the cycle of Maat, the cycle of order, of day of night, of the continuation of the world. And so today we will focus on the funerary religion, what we call funerary religion of the ancient Egyptians, because it's also very rich of images to understand how the Egyptians were considering the world, the beyond, as a sort of double world, and where they were having a new life. And in order to understand funerary religion, one has to also understand their idea of what is the body and how the body survives in the netherworld. And we have a lot of representations and a lot of funerary religious texts describing the body. And through those sources, we can understand what death was for the ancient Egyptians. And I like a lot how Jan Assmann, a very important historian of religions, not just an Egyptologist, but he's been working also on many more topics connected to religious studies. And so Jan Assmann, in one of his books on ancient Egyptian funerary religion, defined death for the ancient Egyptian as a separation and isolation. Why? What is the separation? The separation is indeed the body that stays in the tomb, the mummified body, and the isolation of this body. The physical body was very important for the ancient Egyptians, and this, of course, explains why they were so obsessed with mummifications, why we have all those mummified bodies in ancient Egypt. The mummification process was also a process inspired by protecting that body. And they had different terms to indicate the mummified body, or instead the corpse of a human who is not mummified. So here on the screen, you can see those different words, khat, indicating indeed just the corpse, while once this corpse is mummified, they call it sah. And it's very interesting. I really always like to look at words in ancient Egyptian language, because and their use, because this same word that indicate the mummified body also is used as a sort of honorific, as a title to indicate a worthy man, someone who is, in some cases, it indicates really an aristocratic man, and indeed mummification wasn't for everyone. But it's really used in the sense of indicating that the mummified body belongs to a worthy man. And so the preservation of the body was very important. Being mummified into a sack was very important, because only after this happened, then the other parts of the person, and we will talk about those other parts in a moment, could travel in the netherworld. And here you see a quote from in one of those ancient funerary texts: "One shall cut off a foreleg for your ka and a heart for your mummy. May your ba ascend, may your corpse descend." We talked about the corpse, so we will see what the ka is. The ka is mostly connected to the life power of each Egyptian. As well as the ba, which is a sort of definitely commonly translated as soul, and indicating the most mobile part of the body. And in this scene, which is taken from one of those compositions that decorated the royal tombs at the time of Ramses II, the so-called Book of Caverns, you see indeed those corpses here. Those are corpses of deities that are isolated and protected by those ovals. They look like cartouche, and they surround another body which is protected, isolated, separated a bit from the rest of the world, and that's the body, the mummified body of Osiris, the god of the dead. Those snakes here function as guardians. Snakes were very important in the ancient Egyptian imagery of the netherworld. They were chthonic animals connected indeed to the earth, to the ground, and therefore their role of guardians in the underground, in the subterranean netherworld of the ancient Egyptian is always very much stressed. And so images like this indeed talk to us about the importance of bodies in the netherworld. For them, life after death was just not a journey of the soul, but bodies played a lot of important also features. And we see it, as I said, in many tomb decorations. This is from the tomb of Nefertari, the spouse of Ramses the Great, beautiful tomb, which has been restored as well. So you can see the colors are really bright and beautiful, and so-called Queen's Valley 66. And so here again, we see an image of a mummified body, probably in a coffin, on a funerary bed, and different kind of bodies. An anthropomorphic body, this is still a god, is the god Nun, the god of one of the primordial gods. It represented the primordial waters, and indeed you can note how his body is completely blue, like the waters indeed. And then we have two kites, two beautiful kites that actually we can recognize as Isis and Nephthys, the sisters of Osiris, who in the myth of death and rebirth of Osiris played the role also of mourners of the mummified body before the rebirth of Osiris. And this is indeed also the role they have in this scene, together with other animal manifestation of divine presences, divine symbols. And those divine manifestations of gods in the form of animals are also very frequent in tombs. And probably you know that the Egyptian gods could manifest a lot as animals. We don't have just anthropomorphic gods, but also hybrid gods. We will see them in a minute, or fully animals gods. And so, as I said already, a key word was protection. Protection in life, but also in the netherworld. And this protection was expressed through images of guardians protecting especially the body. This is clear from those magical texts that accompany those images, where those guardians are called in ancient Egyptian watchers, or also murderers, wanderers, or squatting ones. And in fact, they are represented squatting, or they can also be standing with mummified bodies very often, and animal head. Here you see examples of those from, this is a detail from the one in the lower register, is a detail from a beautiful coffin where the guardians are very often depicted outside the coffin, like protecting the whole body, in the same way Isis and Nephthys were protecting the body of Osiris. The one here, this is not the same images, are two photos, one beside the other. So the one in the upper register represents an older coffin from the Middle Kingdom, so from the 2nd century BC. The one below is from the 1st millennium BC. And at this time, in the 2nd millennium BC, coffins were mostly in wood. They were rectangular in wood. They had still some decorations, and you see here other forms of guardians, this time anthropomorphic guardians holding snakes, and then a text with the spells nearby to identify. Why all these images of guardians? So that was because the deceased needs to recognize them in order to pass through the various regions of the netherworld. Since those were protectors, they were also dangerous if you don't know how to approach them. And this is why they had those scary names like murderers or wanderers. And I have other names here, more individual names of those guardians, those agents of protection is how I like to call them in my upcoming book, but they can be also agents of punishment. But their names definitely refer to parts of their body and to their scary and fearful aspects. So as you can read here, and I added here the transcription of the Egyptian Sehed-Her Ashahiru. This is the transliteration system we use in ancient Egypt. Face downwards, numerous of shapes, or the Semeti, the Hearer, the Acheru, the Shadow Voice, the Junhat, one who stretcheth out his eyebrow, or the second hair, one with vigilant face, Asebu, the radiant one. So those were beings really with very specific agency and with the task. They weren't moving much. They're generally represented in papyri or tombs while sitting in their gate, the entrance they protect to certain regions of the netherworld, and they can hold the knives, and they have interesting faces, sometimes animals that you can recognize easily, like here probably a lion, or here an hare. Sometimes they are fully human, and sometimes they can have even double faces, like in this case you see this sort of leonine face, probably inspired to the face of the dwarf god Bes, who was also protector god. So those are demonic agents with the function of protecting gates and regions on the netherworld, strictly related to those spaces, and they become very popular in papyri and tomb scenes. And the fact that they have visible bodies whose depiction accompany the textual mentions of their names helps the deceased to recognize, so to know the demons. And the guardian's iconography is indeed an integral part of this sort of esoteric, exclusive knowledge about what the Egyptian called Duat, the Egyptian netherworld, provided especially by the Book of the Dead corpus of religious text and images. And so the visualization of each guardian empowers the place that the deceased has to pass through, a door, a gate, a region. And it is significant that many of the guardians' names or epithets referring it to those physical characteristics. And so this is from a private papyrus of a private individual, but the same guardians can be found also in royal tombs. And some of the most beautiful guardians indeed appear in terms of, those are really art masterpieces. They appear again in the tomb of Nefertari. You can see one of my favorite is this female guardian, lioness guardian with two uproaring cobras, snakes on her head. That is one of the guardians of so-called spell 144 of the Book of the Dead. And you can see in this image how she is placed in the space within a triad of guardians as well, all the knives, the Ankh sign, the sign of life in ancient Egypt. And within the three-dimensional architecture of the tomb, you really, if you enter the tomb, you have this sensation of seeing the guardians around, really protecting the space. You see here they are in front of an entrance, one of the gates, and this continues all around the tomb, together with the image of the queen, worshipping the gods, and then entering those gates and addressing those guardians with very effective spells. And very often the speech of the deceased to the guardian start by saying, "I know you, I know your name." So this esoteric knowledge, this important knowledge, which was necessary in order to pass through the regions of the netherworld, started from the name. By knowing the name of a creature, you can also control that creature, or at least make sure that they will let you pass. And the idea of knowing the names as esoteric knowledge is not only Egyptian, it can be found in many other magical traditions. And so those are the so-called demons. We could call them demons, although the English term is not exactly what the Egyptians meant. Those demons are also protectors, as I said. They weren't connected to an higher evil entity. But in the Greek sense of the word, the daimon as a sort of intermediary spirit, indeed, we can call them demons because indeed they were different from the gods with temple on earth. So who were the gods instead living also on earth, having houses on earth, the temple being their house? Those are what the Egyptians called the Necheru. And those were the gods protecting the pharaoh, but also the dead. We see here a beautiful relief fragment that you can also admire right now at the Young, with deities represented on it. We can recognize for sure here Osiris with the mummified body and the special crown, and probably, I mean, not probably, this is Isis because the name is here, but could be also Hathor because of the cow horns. It's a beautiful lady, always connected to Osiris. And Anubis, the famous jackal god. And so where is the pharaoh? Well, I was talking about the importance of the name. Here, Ramses II is not represented in his bodily form, but through his name. We have, as you can see here, a long, elongated cartouche. The cartouche was the oval of protection of the pharaoh name. And inside the cartouche, we have the name of Ramses with different titles. If you're interested to know, so those titles, Ramses II has had many royal titles and so-called royal names, and those here are the Usermat Ra, Setep and Ra, Wesermat Ra, Setep and Ra again, and so something that can be translated like the justice of Ra is powerful, chosen by Ra. Or chosen of Ra. So for Ramses, the worship of the sun god was really important, was very central. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, Ra is also part of his name. His birth name was Ramesu, indeed, right? Ra has fashioned him. Also beloved of Amun is written there. So basically his name here replaces the bodily manifestation of the bodily figure of the pharaoh. So it's just an example also to show you how important the name was in the religious universe of the ancient Egyptians, and the name needed protection as well. And here I have another beautiful images also from inspired to a spell of the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead is also one of my specialty. My PhD was actually about the papyrus of the Book of the Dead. So excuse me if I use a lot of them, but I think you will enjoy all these images, not only text, but also those beautiful vignettes. This is in particular, the spell 94 of the Book of the Dead, where the deceased learned about the mysteries of Thoth, the god of writing. And you can note here a beautiful frog, and the frog was, for the ancient Egyptians, also a symbol of eternity. So this is a formula for requesting the writing palette and water well from Thoth. And we see here the queen, the beautiful queen in front of Thoth. So it's one of the many sources that let us understand how important is to receive this sacred knowledge, and how this knowledge of the writing, of the text comes from the gods. So we don't have texts that are signed by the scribes in ancient Egypt, because the main authority, the authors of the religious text, are always the gods. So this is also an important principle to remember when we try to understand religious text. There's not a concept of authorship, and the same is for pieces of art. We don't find the signature of the artist. And so here an image of Maat, what is right, and indeed, as I mentioned, the idea of maintaining Maat on earth was connected to the fact that the pharaoh needs the blessings of the deities in order to be able to rule on the created world of Egypt, on the land of Egypt. And Maat is the winged goddess recognizable for her feather used as headdress. And Maat is the goddess of what is right, generally translated as truth, but I like more to say that the real translation of Maat is what is right, because it's in terms of ethics, what was right then, it's also sort of different that what we consider to be right or to be truth today, right? So that's for another lecture, maybe, on the idea of justice and order in ancient Egypt. But again, in all these images, you see how the royal persons, in this case, again, Nefertari, is always in connection with the gods, and how again the name also here of Nefertari is written in a cartouche and placed in connection to protective images of gods. And here another one, gods and pharaohs together in the tomb of Ramses the First this time. And this we see here the pharaoh in front of a manifestation of the sun god. As I was saying, the gods could manifest also as hybrid. In this case, the sun god here has the face of a scarab. The scarab heifer was a symbol of becoming, of transformation, and indeed this is Ra Hepri, sort of mixed form of the sun god, to which the pharaoh again is offering. So it's there is always this performance in religious practices, not just prayers, but doing things here at Het. Followed here, the pharaoh is followed by other divine bodies. Those are the so-called souls of Pe and Nehen. And Pe and Nehen were two important cult centers in ancient Egypt. And so those so-called souls is the translation which is used. They are Ba, so Ba, we will see what the Ba is in ancient Egypt. They always accompany the deceased. And you can see here again all those series of figures of gods and the pharaohs that are represented in representations, in tomb representations. So here is the same tombs and Ramses the First, you can recognize it here in the middle, in front of Osiris, holding hands with Nate, Horus. Nate is the goddess, recognizable by her headdress. And then we have Atum and Horus bringing the god, bringing the pharaoh in front of Osiris. And here we have also a little figure of a priest. And again, just to show you more examples of those theories, those series of divine figures protecting the pharaohs during death. We have a really great photo from the tombs of Ramses the Sixth, and the sarcophagus of Ramses the Sixth was rebuilt in the tomb thanks to a restoration project supported by the American Research Center in Egypt, and I serve in their board, and thanks to them we have many of those ancient tombs and monuments to be restored. This beautiful sarcophagus was found broken, and so it's been put together again within the tomb without being moved from the tomb. But let's look at these other parts of the person. So beyond the body and the mummified body that I was mentioning before, the Ka is a very important sub concept. The Ka can be translated as life source, so it's a double of the dead. And many pharaohs had Ka statues. So the statue representing the cow, the pharaoh, was the target of the offerings. Being the Ka the life source, you bring offerings to the Ka statue. And this is why, well, we have a very famous Ka statue, is the one of earlier ruler Harawi Bra, dating to the 13th dynasty of ancient Egypt, so 1800 BC. But recently, in 2019 only, they discovered also Ramses II statue of the Ka in pink granite, a beautiful statue that you see here, was just unearthed. And so the cow was important because sustaining the deceased with offerings was part of this accessing life in the netherworld. And this is another piece from the exhibition in the Young, where you will see this painted line and clothes of Sennefer. And Sennefer was an important worker at Deir el-Medina, the village of workers who were building the tombs in the Valley of the King. And we see here the cloth depicting Sennefer seated at an offering table with a hieroglyphic text reading the Osiris, servant in the place of truth. The place of truth is Deir el-Medina, and then Sennefer here, his name. And we found in Deir el-Medina many of these clothes that were used indeed to magically perform and sustaining the body with offerings. The other part that was important beside the body and the ka was the ba. And as I mentioned, the ba is generally seen as the soul for the ancient Egyptians. But in fact, what I also always say to my students is the ba is very importantly represented with the body, is a bird with the head of the deceased. And you can see how the artists were really careful in making sure that the head of the ba would really resemble the head of the deceased, as in this representation from a private tomb of the time of Ramses III, so 20th dynasty, Theban tomb 59 of Hiner Khao. So those were the tombs of the elite at the time of Ramses. And so the ba is important because is the mobile part that can leave the tomb. The ba can come back on earth and maintain a sort of relationship with the world on earth, with the relatives of the deceased on earth, but always had to go back to the tomb and join again the body of the deceased. And we have many images of very famous bas, like the beautiful bas of Nefertari again, who is here represented 3 times. She's worshipping, so religious act again. As a ba, she's standing on top of the tomb, so she's supposed to be already out of the tomb. And in this shrine, Nefertiti is playing senet. Senet was a sort of chess game for the ancient Egyptians. The word senet, we think, may mean something like passing. So passing what? Passing probably the netherworld, passing the judgment in the netherworld, going through the whole journey, overcoming all the dangers during this journey. And so senet, the fact that the deceased is represented while playing senet in the netherworld is symbolic for the fact that each deceased, even royal deceased, has to go through a series of challenges in the netherworld. And another beautiful images from another tomb of the time of Ramses, the tomb of Ramses IV. Unfortunately, I don't have images from the tomb of Ramses II, because that has been flooded in antiquity already, and the decorations, which were probably very similar to the one I'm showing to you, are not in good conditions, unfortunately. But those tombs were all decorated with images of the netherworld. And here we have a very rare representation of the ba of the gods in this bird, this little bird, on top of this body, this manifestation, God manifestation of an ithyphallic Osiris. You recognize the guardian snake and those ovals representing bodies, and again we have here bodies of gods. But you may recognize how different instead those bodies are here, upside down, headless, with arms tied behind the back. Those were the bodies of the damned, of those deceased who could not pass the final judgment, could not become gods themselves, and they were punished in the netherworld. And this is why we talk about the Egyptian hell, so a place where actually the sinners were punished. And I don't really like to use this word sinner, because indeed it's not really related to the ancient Egyptian way to think about what is right, what is wrong, but definitely those were, let's say, the bad guys who cannot become gods. They cannot go through the whole journey in the netherworld, cannot be transfigured. Okay, this is also from the so-called Book of Caverns. And finally, the other important part of the body in the netherworld is the Ak. Ak, that we translate as transfigured spirit, effective spirit, so the deceased after passing the judgment. And the Ak was also a word used for indicating the ancestors. And we have in ancient Egypt also a cult of the ancestors. Ancestors were relatives of past generations. We have those beautiful stelas also from Deir el-Medina, where indeed there is this veneration of the Aku, those effective spirits or ancestors. And in some magical spells, though, Ak, the hieroglyph is this crested ibis, a bird. The Aku could be also sort of ghost. They can come back on earth. So that there is, the use of the term is varies a lot. And so to recap a bit the idea of the body, while the Ak is the transfigured spirit, at the end of the journey, the deceased is mostly represented instead as a body, as a human body, and as Ba going out of the tomb. And we have spells of the Book of the Dead. Indeed, the name of the Book of the Dead in ancient Egyptian is actually going out by day, Peret Emheru. Book of the Dead is the modern name. And so those images are always represented while going out, coming back in the tomb, being very, very mobile, being very, they move a lot in the space. And so the whole idea of life after death is about conserving, saving, protecting the body, and let the other parts of the dead move around. And we know this already since the very beginning of the ancient Egyptian civilization in prehistoric time, in what we call Nakada culture. And you see, we are here around 3600 BC. And this is a reconstructed burial where the body is already buried with a funerary equipment. And we have those potteries, those vases where representation of boats and traveling were already there. And pyramid text carved in the pyramids of the 3rd millennium BC, where it is said, "Hail to you, ostrich which is on the bank of the winding waterway. Open my way that I may pass." The ostrich is here, of course, godly manifestation. Winding waterway is part of this netherworld made of water and fire, and always this kind of prayers always have the idea, an expression related to opening the way, making someone pass by. And so this is an image of those pyramid texts, the oldest corpus of funerary texts in ancient Egypt, carved starting from the pyramid of Unis in the 5th dynasty, so around 2400 BC. Again, the name of Unis in the cartouche, protected, separated, isolated by the cartouche in the middle of the magical text. There are no images in the pyramid text, but only text. Images start to come later when coffins are decorated with the same spells, and images are represented together with the text. And those are the second millennium coffins in wood that I mentioned also before. And that's why we talk about pyramid text in the third millennium, text carved in the pyramid, and then coffin text on the coffins with the same spells and some new additions that have been re-elaborated. And this is also the period where we find the first maps of the netherworld. You can maybe noted here those ways. This is the so-called Book of the Two Ways, because it represents two ways through which the deceased has to go through, one of water and one of fire, and all these beings, supernatural beings that play the role of guardians, gods being there, similar to what we see then later at the time of Ramses. So I realize I'm a bit out of time. I'm trying to be fast, but I wanted to show you some more images also from the exhibition. Definitely one of the highlights of the exhibitions is this beautiful coffin, indeed, outer coffin of St. Negem, the same guy I showed you before with the funerary clothes. And this coffin is completely decorated with spells from the Book of the Dead, images of gods, guardians, and you recognize here the bas here of St. Negem and his wife, which are here represented near this shrine where inside which St. Negem and his wife are sitting in front of offerings. And I have another image. This is the room of the exhibition, and they did a great job by reconstructing the tomb decoration of the tomb of St. Negem with the coffin in the middle. So you can walk around, look at the coffin, but at the same time look at the tomb decoration of the tomb, so the walls with the tomb decoration, and maybe try to recognize how some of the images of the coffin correspond to those of the tomb. So we don't know how much the influence of the owner of the tomb was there in terms of choosing which gods to represent, which spells of the Book of the Dead, how to organize the decoration, because they were preparing those tombs when the owner was still alive. We don't know much the owner was choosing from this catalog of images and text, but definitely we can see how those artists in Deir el-Medina privileged teams that were also present in the royal tombs. And so since they were working in the royal tombs, they were probably inspired then for their own tombs in terms of representations. And we have seen the Egyptian hell, but they had also sort of Egyptian paradise, the so-called field of offerings or field of Hetep, also represented in Spell of the Book of the Dead, number 110. Where we see the deceased who is working here in the fields. And one may ask, why working? If you're in paradise, you should be retired, enjoy retirement. But actually, this was another symbol of how good life was in the netherworld. It's so good that you can do whatever you were doing on earth, and you could, and there is vegetation, there is abundance, there is fertility in those very earthly regions, although they are placed in the netherworld. But the netherworld becomes a sort of mirror of life on earth. And so we call them books of the netherworld when those representation on coffins and on tomb walls, and some of them are like the field of offerings, kind of easier to interpret. Others are more difficult, and so they become enigmatic, like those images from the royal shrine of Tutankhamun, where we see bodies of gods with the solar disk and composite images in between. So this is really the esoteric knowledge that took place, especially at the time of Ramses in the Ramessic period, and it was accessible only to few, only to those who really know the temple text. Even though we think that even if you could not grasp the complex significance of those narratives, you could still benefit from images and text because of their magical protection. So the idea of being able to read the text or understand the images wasn't really something that they were focusing on, but what was important indeed was that the decoration was there, the magical function could be enacted. And if you think that those tombs weren't supposed to be open, they weren't thinking to an audience, to a public enjoying those pieces of arts like we do today in museums, but they were still really being very careful in copying down the right narratives, the right images around those beautiful coffins and on tomb walls. And we have tomb walls that have been treated as papyri. So in the, for instance, in the tomb of Thutmose III, this is the tomb wall. Seems like being a papyrus, but it's a tomb. And there is an whole sequence of the 12 hours of the night. Then that's the so-called amduat, what is in the duat, with starting with the first hour of the night where the sun descends in the evening, and continuing then with the king being within this space and meeting all those divine beings with different bodies. You see here in the second hour, different kind of guardians, you see, with vegetal elements and knives. And at the end of these images with captions to say the names of those beings, there is a longer text. You can see how this kind of looks like more a papyrus, but this was on tomb. So basically the tomb walls are used as surfaces for extensive narratives. This is especially typical of royal tombs of the Ramessic period. And so the importance then of the final rebirth of the sun, which was related to the rebirth of the pharaoh and of the dead in general. And I wanted to conclude with an image of the pink granite coffin of Ramses III. So successor after Ramses II. We are in the 22nd dynasty. And again, you can see here the importance of representing different kind of bodies and not only the beatification of the deceased, but also the punishment of the enemies. And you will recognize the enemies from the fact that they always have tied up arms behind their body, and very often they are headless. While the boat represent always the boat of the sun god with the following of gods, and here being attacked, by the way, by a giant snake, Apopis, with the divine arch enemy trying to stop creation, but he is always pushed back. He's never killed, but he's pushed back by helpers of the sun god. And this is a wonderful book. It's in German, but it's so full of images that even if you cannot read German, you really would enjoy the photos. Some of them I show you today come from this book, Bilder der Unsterblickeit, that is curated by Zachia Was, but with the photos of Sandro Vannini, the Italian photographer I mentioned to you before. Here I'm ready now finally for questions. Sorry if I talked a bit too long, probably. I had too many images. please feel free to get in touch as well. If you want to know more about those images and the ancient Egyptian netherworld, I work especially on a project on the digitization of ancient Egyptian coffins. This is one of them, and together with my students, we build 3D models of those coffins, which are shareable and can be seen on my website. You see here 3D coffins at Berkeley EDU. We are also on Sketchfab, and I have a Facebook page with a lot of Egyptian contents. And thank you for your attention.
Professor, thank you very, very much. This has been wonderful. We have unfortunately run out of time for you to answer the questions that have come in the chat room. But what I propose, given your generous offer, is we will send you these chat questions. And if you would take a moment to respond to them, you know, we will be posting this talk to the Ali YouTube site after we're able to caption it. And we will send to everybody who's a participant today the link to that, as well as some of the answers to the questions. I think if you were to take 4 or 5 of the main questions, that would be really wonderful. I want to let people know that on February 4th, Dr. Lucarelli will be at the de Young Museum again for another event that's both free to the public and live streamed. And so please go to the de Young Museum website. It's under the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. Take a look. We may also, if you are interested in going to that event on February 4th, if we have a member who is interested in helping to just get people organized, that could be underway. But what a full hour you've given us. We are so very, very, very thankful. This is, you have kicked off a week of classes and events that will go through Friday. I hope all of you that are here today will take a look at the Ali website. You've heard from us. Look at all the events that you can still sign up and participate in. And again, thank you everybody for today, and especially Professor Lucarelli, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. And yes, I'm happy to answer the question if you send them over.
We will. We'll send you the questions in the chat room. Okay.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Okay. Bye.